Welcome to Scan Health Can, the podcast where we explore the crucial role of healthcare supply chain. Each episode is a new chapter in the exploration of best practices, innovations, and advancements, ensuring that at the end of the healthcare supply chain, we prioritize the most vital element, human life. And understanding the people behind each link in the healthcare supply chain is crucial. In this episode, Dr. Anne Snowden speaks with Dr. Christian Leuprecht, Distinguished Professor in Leadership at the Royal Military College. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
My name is Anne Snowden. I am Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at University of Windsor and the CEO of Scan Health, a supply chain focus on healthcare in Canada. And I am immensely thrilled to speak to our guest on this podcast, Dr. Christian Leuprecht. He is the Distinguished Professor of Leadership at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. He's also the editor of Canadian Military Journal and brings an exceptionally unique perspective on this whole question of, do Canadian health systems have the health products they need to deliver care to Canadians when and where it's needed? So welcome, Christian. I am so thrilled to have you join me today.
And the pleasure of my last 3 years has been to get to know you and the amount that I've learned from you and your team in an area about which I understood and I guess still understand relatively little. So thanks for the opportunity to have these synergistic conversations and see what we can do better in mirroring supply chains, healthcare supply chains, and a security, intelligence, defense, foresight perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Security, intelligence, defense perspective is exactly what I think will be a fascinating discussion today. So if you could start, Christian, by maybe take us back a little bit. You've done incredible amounts of work in leadership and geopolitical policies and frameworks, the military perspective, the whole question of security. Can you give us a bit of background on where and how that perspective brings some unique insights to this whole question of supply chain in healthcare systems in Canada?
Well, maybe let's start with a perspective that the audience will particularly understand, so Canadian perspective, and why we find ourselves in the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And I think that's largely driven by our geography, right? So we share the continent with the largest economy in the world, with the largest healthcare system in the world, with the largest defense, intelligence, security complex in the world. And so it's on the one hand very convenient, but also very expeditious to hitch our wagon to the United States.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of talk about like we need to somehow diversify or so, but of course, it turns out that that's really hard to do for a whole host of reasons. And so I think where we need to have a more intelligent conversation is about where areas where that relationship with the US has not just been of disproportionate benefit to us when it comes to our healthcare systems, our healthcare supply chains, but what are also some of the risks that that relationship poses, and being able to understand and have a much better sense of foresight of what are the different possible disruptions, whether they're political, economic, social, geopolitical, and how do we mitigate against those? Do we mitigate against those by more explicitly deepening that relationship and working out particular deals with the Americans around that? Do we retrench into a more sovereign sort of capacity? Do we work more closely with other allies, in particular in Europe? Do we look more to the Indo-Pacific, which is, of course, where much of sort of the ingredients for much of sort of what we produce and sort of the baseline material sort of comes from? And so I think people underestimate sort of the complexity that we find ourselves in. And on those notes, like on all of these, there's opportunity space here, right? It's like on the premise of never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
What is it that we can offer to the Americans when it comes to healthcare and healthcare supply chains? Where is our comparative advantage? Where a White House, a Congress will say, well, this is exactly why we actually need the Americans, we need the Canadians to work with that can mitigate some of the tensions that and some of the criticisms that we've been seeing from some circles in Washington. But at the same time, also, it's a strategic leverage with our allies in Europe, right? So our allies in Europe are worried about the prospect of, on the one hand, the United States doing less for Europe, and on the other hand, the possibility of a conflict or so with hostile powers in Europe. What can Canada provide that provides sort of what in the defense business we call defense in depth? So as to say, it's much more difficult to attack or to undercut supply chains to Canada because we're so nicely situated with the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, plus our relationship with the United States. So, usually we think of this, Canada can export energy, in particular liquefied natural gas, for instance, to Europe. Canada can invest in defense and help to shore up European deterrence. But is there something that Canada can also do strategically with Europe? And why do we need that relationship? Well, on the one hand, we need to influence the relationship and decision-making with our most important strategic partner, which is the United States. But we also need to counterbalance the risk of the vagaries of US unilateralism. And traditionally, we've done that by having close ties with European partners to provide a counterbalance. But of course, we've not been very strategic or good at that if we think of energy exports or defense investments. So can we build a bit of a package that might include healthcare supply chain capabilities that Canada can provide, working with European manufacturers that might also then help us in our own country? Can we encourage people to invest here, for instance, in ways that shores up our own interests, shores up US interests, but also provide some reassurance for Europeans that are worried about disruptions that might be sort of more immediate to their own health systems. So how do we overcome the fallacy of composition, actually have a strategy rather than sort of this always chasing the bright, shiny lure?
Right. Or always waiting for the crisis and then running around very significantly and trying to fix it when we could have had line of sight to it ahead of that crisis unfolding. So if you were to identify for every supply chain organization in Canada, focused on healthcare, obviously, what would you say are the most significant challenges, or sorry, the most significant strategies we should be spending time focusing on? To your point, yes, you can run around and look for other sources of things. Not that strategic, but yeah, could be helpful. What would you say the number 1, 2, or 3 you pick strategies health supply chain should be zeroing in on, given what we know today, and we might even be anticipating down the road?
So the federalism scholar in me wants to say subsidiarity.
Okay.
We've adopted this approach that we want central governments to solve all of our problems.
Yep.
And so I recently did a book on the Canada-US border where I pointed out there's not just one Canada-US border, there's a host of different borders. There's different regions with different priorities. And where does that come from? Well, because we live in a federation. Well, the nice thing about a federation is we have 10 laboratories of experimentation, each of which deal with their issues in different ways. Some have more resources, some have fewer resources. So we can learn from one another. And if nothing else, I always like to say, at least we can learn what doesn't work. So let's not replicate the same mistake 10 times. And I think we did reasonably okay during COVID. But I think especially when we talk about healthcare, that healthcare really is, and I mean, provinces have obviously struggled in different ways around this, but it really is a local matter.
Yeah.
We don't want the federal government to take out our garbage. In the same way, like, why are we looking to the federal government to solve sort of our healthcare issues, where this is really for our local communities to figure out what are the needs, values, and expectations for each community? What are the risks in each community? If you're an indigenous community in the far north, your risks when it comes to healthcare supply chains are going to be very different than if you're a St. Margaret's Hospital in Toronto.
Right.
And so I think we like to sort of simplify things and like to sort of have these large scale approaches. I think that's what appeals to electorates. But really, I think what we want to do is we want to empower local leaders, but we also want to then give them the toolkits to do so. The problem is, of course, that as you know, our localities, our local facilities are hopelessly underfunded relative to the demand that they have. So how can we provide them with some of the tools that allow them to assess their own risks and sort of build their own strategies for resilience? And then we scale up to the provincial level and to the federal level those issues that we can solve ultimately at a local level. But I think the temptation is always to look at a higher level of government
Right.
to provide that foresight, to provide that leadership. And I think that's just simply not going to be happening, especially in the political environment that we live in today. So, how do we empower our localities, and how do we do better at learning from one another?
And no question, we saw that learning from one another in the pandemic, but I might add through multiple historical major disruptions. Then the question becomes, Canada's a massive landmass in terms of size. We are an exceptionally small population and market in this health products supplies. We're less than 2% of the world's market. We don't really matter that much in terms of whether a company they sell to Canada or not, because we're just too small, right? So how do you mobilize, and I think you're right, give that empowerment to the local jurisdictions, however they're defined, to solve what their populations need in terms of health systems, but still construct that Canada first, if you will, or that Canada collaboration, so that at least there's some opportunity in going to the global markets for disruptions of supplies, as opposed to, every one of the thousands of hospitals we have, or every team across every province. That competition internally didn't help us. The collective achievement. So tell me that one, because that is, I completely agree with you on the needs, and don't wait for the government to solve all our problems. You need to solve those populations and jurisdictions you're working in. But how do we overcome that profound limitations in the global market so that we can access products when they go into disruption and we're not that big a competitor?
Well, I think it brings us back to my first answer that we've been very reactive because we've had the privilege of being reactive. And the environment that we live in, as you rightly point out, if we're not deliberate about how we build that capacity and make ourselves valuable to our allies. And of course, there's smaller countries that have done that.
Yeah.
Think of a country such as Korea that doesn't have all the benefits that we come with, that had to be very deliberate about how it integrates into the global economic supply chain. When you don't have resources, when you live in a dangerous neighborhood and the like. And Canada, of course, in terms of its universities, in terms of its high tech, in terms of its minerals, in terms of the nexus at which it sits between sort of the Euro-Atlantic community, the Indo-Pacific community, and the Americas, has a huge amounts of potential in biotechnology and the like. What we haven't done is have the foresight of how do we actually bring that investment here and make it attractive. The answer to these problems is always, well, the government's going to put in a few $100 million so somebody can build some facility. But of course, we need to be realistic about how much money everybody in Canada. The answer to every problem is government needs to spend more money. Well,
yeah, guess what? That's not going to work.
We're facing a $46 billion structural deficit. So this is about the government's direct federal government spending is a little bit over 100 billion a year. So our structural deficit is just under half of that. You can't even cut your way out of that. So the idea that we're just going to spend more money to solve these issues is completely utopian.
Right.
But what we can do is we can try to generate a vibrant industry in an area where we already have a comparative advantage in terms of our own skills, training, education, research, and to some extent our industrial base. And because of the nexuses which we said, where it would be interesting for companies to invest here. And I think the simple answer to that is long-term contracts, right? So that the federal government, if we have a strategy, we can figure out what are the sort of capabilities, the sort of capacities, the outputs and the outcomes we want to achieve in this country when it comes to healthcare supply chains. And where can the government provide either underwrite long-term contracts, provide social bonds, which would be a more European sort of solution to some of this, that ensures that companies have the certainty that if they're going to make these big investments, they're going to be able to reap the returns on those investments. And so there are market-based strategies that can make us a lot more resilient. And as I say, also much bigger asset to our allies sort of at the same time. It just seems like we're just always so preoccupied about like, what does the next sort of fiscal transfer in health from the federal government to the provinces need to be? We can never quite seem to wrap our head around sort of the broader role that healthcare in Canada can and should play strategically for Canada and for allies and partners, and how a deliberate strategy could actually foster that. And of course, this is Canada, so we're probably going to come up with a strategy. So we'll have the ends. We might even define the ways, but then we'll never allocate the means to it. So the strategy is going to just die a slow death on some shelf somewhere. So how do we actually turn this into reality?
Yeah, so how do we turn this into a reality? You've mapped out the strategy, Christian, in Technicolor. And it's been pretty clear for many years, many crises like COVID and before that SARS, and I can name many others. What does Canada, keep doing what you've always done, expect a different result, you're kind of wasting your time, right? What do we need for that strategy to move forward? Couldn't agree more. Long-term contracts, investments, a game plan would be good. Is it a failure in leadership? Is it we've got too many leaders and all 10 different leaders in 10 different provinces and they're all going different directions? What is it that has to come together to change where we find ourselves and not just reactive, oh, the federal government needs to spend more money, because that's just not a solution that seems viable any longer, if I'm understanding correctly.
So, well, certainly creating more uncertainty is not going to help any form of investment in this country. So the first priority needs to be, how can we create certainty political and economically?
Yeah.
The second is to think about that politics is about making choices.
Right.
And politicians tend to like to call themselves retail politicians. So it's about what's going to get them votes in their local constituency. And, healthcare supply chains don't figure very high on that priority list.
That's right.
But politicians do react to incentives. We see this, when you get threatened with tariffs or so, all of a sudden, people jump and the like. So, and, ultimately, I think this needs to reflect the priorities of Canadians and to understand that when you show up at your physician's office or you go to the pharmacy, things don't just magically appear in that shelf, that there's a very complex supply chain that makes sure that it gets there, that anticipates shortages before they ever show up and the like. And so I think having much higher expectations by Canadians of that healthcare isn't just about, that we can change the discourse about, how long do I have to wait for my hip surgery or my knee surgery? If we reduce political incentives around to simply that as our healthcare system, and, to also look at countries that actually do this reasonably successfully, other smaller countries that already do this more successfully. In part, I think, because there's a more deliberate, the federal government technically has substantial leverage because of the way it exercises what's known as the power of the purse through fiscal federalism, the funding that it provides to provinces to say that, we don't want to tell you we're not going to tell provinces how to shore up their healthcare supply chains, but just like we've made data sharing now an important part of that fiscal federal arrangement, I think the federal government could very well say in the aftermath of COVID, healthcare supply chains and your strategy on that, your resilience on that, your reporting on that, your transparency on that is an important component of the conditions under which you're going to continue to receive um, additional funding for supposedly public health care. And of course, that's a whole separate conversation because we talk about healthcare supply chain, we talk about public health care, but of course, pretty much your entire healthcare supply chain is private, right?
Yeah.
So it gets us also to this profound misunderstanding that Canadians have that somehow we have a public healthcare system. This supposedly public healthcare system wouldn't function if it wasn't for an entirely privatized healthcare supply chain until the point where perhaps like some medication or some piece of kit finds its way into the hospital. So actually understanding that the market plays an important role and the role of government in fixing market failures when it comes to healthcare supply chains and incentivizing the market and public expectations with regards to government to do that and to hold politicians to account.
Yep.
I was stunned the extent to which Canadians did not hold politicians to account for the failures
Yep.
of the healthcare system. We simply sort of blamed it on hospitals and we blamed it on whatever else, as opposed to like, no, this was clearly a function of a significant political failure. And it seems to me, at least, that politicians basically got a free pass.
And in some ways, you've come right around full circle because you started with we need to learn from others in terms of how this needs to work. If you have no data on your health supply chain, in other words, in Canada today, we don't know what products we have. We don't know where those products are. We don't know who needs them the most. We have bits and pieces of data, private health systems, some federal, some provincial. We really don't all know what we have, what we need, and where is it, and how do we make sure we secure that supply. So it comes back to building, if I'm understanding correctly, building those key insights, knowledge, data, perhaps, what we have, what we need, where can we strategically make sure we never run out of it. And that's called learning and making decisions. And if you don't understand what you need, how do you hold anyone accountable for making sure it happens? I got that right? Or have I missed a piece? Probably have.
It's the attitude we bring to it, right? So I think it's the attitude of that failure is not an option. And if failure is not an option, then we need domain awareness. This is what intelligence organizations do, right? We've said as Canadians, we don't want terrorists to, blow people up in Canadian cities. So we've allocated significant resources to a relatively tiny problem, right?
Yep.
So this is a political choice that we've made. In the same way, but as you point out, we don't have a healthcare intelligence fusion cell, for instance. And those would be classic tasks a federal government should be taking on, right? This is something we would expect the government to take on and to expect the federal government to know and expect to have a strategy to mitigate clear vulnerabilities. But of course, as any economist will tell you, if you have information gaps, or even information failure, you're bound to make suboptimal decisions. So if you don't have domain awareness, how are we going to get to that domain awareness? So we can probably, as a first step, optimize at least our decision making in the near term, and then develop an evidence-informed strategy in the medium term that can mitigate precisely some of what you just laid out.
Okay. And if you do that, that drives and gets you to making those evidence-driven or data-driven decisions on where and how do you build out those long-term contracts, those opportunities for investment with partners globally. Is that the cascade of optimizing your decisions, building out the evidence to drive those decisions and getting to that strategic leadership that hasn't been strong enough to overcome fragility in our health system supply chain.
It would
simple.
it would require a mandate, and this is somewhere I think I really look to a federal minister of health to provide leadership on this file. And health is never a big priority in the federal government. So I would say, if you're the next minister of health of whatever party, can we put this into a mandate letter for the minister that by the time your tenure is done, we want to have full visibility on the entire healthcare supply chain across the country, from the moment goods come into the country to the moment they end up in a hospital.
Yep.
And that we can do this on a national level. Now, we do this in other areas, right? So Transport Canada does this for critical infrastructure monitoring. So Transport Canada has full visibility on all key critical infrastructure across the country because we've decided we can't let that go down. But we don't treat healthcare supply chains like a piece of critical infrastructure. We kind of, it's healthcare. We leave it up to the provinces. Maybe the feds will do some contracts on drug purchases. And ultimately, the poor hospitals and healthcare providers that are already completely overwhelmed, you have to sort it out, if we run short on stuff, too bad for you. Right? This attitude is just, tell me if I'm wrong. But that's sort of the impression that I get of sort of how we run the show. And so, here's an opportunity for a future Minister of Health to take clear ownership and move the goalposts in a way that would have a remarkable impact, I think, not just on the resilience, but probably also would help us significantly use the funds and resources allocated to healthcare supply chains much more efficiently, because you don't know, as you know, what you don't know until you have the full visibility on the data, the gaps in your data, and the vulnerabilities that exposes.
So is this where we find ourselves today pretty unusual? I can honestly say when I look back in the last 2-3 decades, I don't think we have seen some of these geopolitical issues, challenges coming together. And I most definitely haven't seen the relationship challenges with our partners in the US. Is this the time for Canada to put its stake in the ground, declare healthcare supply chain as a critical infrastructure, and mobilize the multiple and different dimensions to achieve much greater security and resilience in our health supply chain? You said earlier, never waste a crisis. Is this the crisis where we do prioritize health supply chain?
It seems to me if you're provincial or federal government, this is something that's actually achievable. How do we want to think about healthcare supply chains? Focus, balance, care. Focus on the job of the integrity and the resilience of the supply chain. Balance it with other political priorities to make sure that it actually gets the attention that it needs, and make sure it is patient and care and people informed, because ultimately it's not really about healthcare supply chains. It's about the people that the healthcare supply chains serve. And it's about those people that end up getting shortchanged, in particular, most vulnerable when the system fails us.
Christian, I couldn't have summarized that any more perfectly. The end of a healthcare supply chain are people's lives and health and wellness, and that needs, as you point out so eloquently, to be the central focus. And there is so much opportunity for us to drive progress and mobilize and achieve some of that resilience in Canada that we have not up until now, for many of the reasons you point out, achieved to date. So I am deeply grateful for your time today. You've given us so much to think about, and want to thank you for spending some time and sharing some of those very, very strategic insights. I think every Canadian really needs to think through and build that motivation and incentive to do better as we head into some uncertain times.
And thank you for your 3 decades of leadership on this file and for taking that on. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you so much, Christian. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.